I think rum is not like some other spirit categories in the way that it is transportive. If you taste rum from, a country like Barbados or Martinique or Jamaica, and you're lucky enough to have it on those islands, you can't separate that experience. Anytime I have Jamaican rum, I will think of Jamaica. There's no separating that experience, and I think that's beautiful. I don't see that in any other spirit category.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of Decoding Cocktails. I'm Chris LeBeau, and if this is your first time listening, welcome to the next best thing in your life, maybe. So my guest today is Adrienne Stoner. She is the rum community liaison for Maison Ferrand. I stumble my way through that every single time. I am a guy with a French last name who does not speak French, so that was my attempt. But Maison Ferrand owns Plantation Rum, which is one of my favorite places to start people with in the rum world. They have such a broad portfolio of products. They are paying me exactly $0 to say that. But it's great. They make a great, dependable product. Adrienne and I had a lot of fun with this conversation. She was in town at the time for a tasting I had the pleasure to attend later on in the day. But we not only talked about her history in the industry, we talked about, she comes from a line of bartenders and that she got her start early in the industry, and that she was fortunate to kind of be under the tutelage pretty early on of people like Paul McGee, who founded bars like Three Dots and a Dash, as well as Lost Lake. Lost Lake did not survive COVID, unfortunately. But now she's moved from the other side of the drink-making bar to really the drink education side of things. And so we, of course, had a chance to dive deep into the spirit. We got to talk about things like the importance of ethically sourcing molasses. Sugar cane has a very rough history in times in terms of being on the ethical side of things, and so Plantation holds that at a paramount of things. We talked about climate change and the kind of the role of how does that impact things, especially we got into that with regards to barrels and the using and or not reusing of wood barrels. We're looking at you, bourbon. We also certainly talked about things like tiki, how this category has kind of evolved a bit, and where we need to be thinking about it right now in terms of what does appropriation look like and not useful. Adrienne spoke to her love of the artist John Waters, so you'll get to hear her talk about her pipe dream for a lovely John Waters themed hotel. And we also jump into things like aging. How do we think about what aging does to a spirit, and the importance of things like fermentation and the quality of molasses depending on the flavors it's going to yield. It was a very wide-ranging conversation, as you can tell. Adrienne was a lot of fun to chat with, I have to say. You can find her on the web at on Instagram at Adrienne, Adrienne Desire, and Plantation is at plantation.rum. Links, of course, like always, will be in the show notes for this stuff. If for some reason, I always forget to say this, you find yourself really enjoying this or have been enjoying this podcast, please subscribe or send an episode to a friend. That's how we grow our reach, and I would most appreciate it. But with that aside, here's my conversation with Adrienne Stoner. Jamaica.com. So Adrienne, you are a lifelong, person in the hospitality industry. What at first drew you into this field, and why the heck are you still here? What keeps you going at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I got into this field because it's the family business in a way. Everyone in my family works in bars and restaurants. My mother is still a bartender out in these streets in Milwaukee. I have a sister in Oakland running a couple of programs like bar managing, doing beer and focusing on, very California craft stuff. And then my sister is also in the industry back in Chicago. So that's kind of the default. I started when I was 12, I think. I begged my mother to come to work with her and started as a dishwasher, worked my way up to plating, then, serving and bartending, et cetera, until here we are all these years later. 17 years bartending with some serving thrown in and some simultaneously. And I just live for hospitality. I don't know. I mean, I think what I like about working on the supplier side is that I have an opportunity to kind of show off rum category to people who maybe are a little tentative or are unfamiliar with the category. And to me, that's just an opportunity to introduce them to something that they might fall in love with. And that's going to, technically it'll just make your life better. If you're, turned on to something and you become enthusiastic and you're an informed, enthusiastic imbiber, it makes every experience better. So, I think it's just an extension of hospitality, and I'm still in it.
And so I guess, for you, in a way, it's like the real impetus was, it was the family business. And so was the draw really like, hey, I see my mom doing this, like I want to be like my mom? Was that kind of what drew you in, and then just the ability to kind of, convey that warmth and guidance to people?
Yeah, I think hospitality is about a connection with people. And I think at a young age, watching my mother work and getting to know all the regulars already knowing me because of their connection through my mother, that's kind of, it's like its own community. So being drawn to that and being drawn to creating an experience for someone, and by creating that experience, you're creating a connection, is really special. I think it's really unique in a lot of other workplaces where things can be very sterile or very like hands-off. That's not the case in hospitality. You get to be very close with not just your customers, but also your coworkers. It's like going to battle every day, and you have a different relationship than you would if you worked a 9 to 5, which was never, not really ever on my radar as it is today.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people out there, the idea that while it might not always be the most fun part of every shift, like when you are just getting just totally like, annihilated on Friday at 8 or whenever people are, you are, when you're strapped, coming out on the other end of that is very affirming, and you're like, okay, we fucking did that together. So.
I think there's a rush, right? Like the service is such a rush. I love it. I love all parts of the bar job, either in the front when you're getting chatty and you get to like talk to rum nerds, or, when I worked at Lost Lake, like we would fight over having the service well shift because it's great. You can get in the zone. You can kind of create your own competition with yourself about how many drinks or how fast you can make them. And it's really an accomplishment to cross-build 6 to 10, 8 cocktails at once, with 10 ingredients each. It's really impressive. And I think, even if nobody's watching, that's a fun thing to do just as a self-challenge. And yeah, I don't know why, like bartenders were just crazy for that kind of thing. Like the harder it is, the better the outcome. But I also think that like the other shining moment of your team is closing. As soon as you let out the last guest and you're winding down, it's kind of the elation of the evening, where you get to talk about all the drama that happened throughout the night, or anything funny, or funny moments with guests. And that's also like a magical moment that I miss. Those things I miss in supplier work, because I don't have that anymore. I'm kind of out here alone.
One thing as I was digging into things, I was intrigued, and I just got my brain thinking. The number of bartenders, people in the industry I know, who have told me that they've had revelatory moments, or that the Sazerac is one of their favorite cocktails, it strikes me as disproportionately interesting. So as somebody that is a lover of it, and I enjoy it myself, what is it about a Sazerac that draws you into it?
It's simple. It's not a drink to show off. You certainly can. You can find flair in anything, right? But I love that it's simple. I have a hard time looking at cocktail menus, and when you're reading ingredients lists and you're deciphering those menus, with the exception of like a tiki drink that, of course, is going to have 10 ingredients. I think people get carried away, and there's something so beautiful about, a 3-ingredient cocktail. Sazerac specifically, if you're using, a really great rye or a really great cognac, something, that is a little bit higher proof, a little bit spicier, it just shines through. And also, the first time I had a Sazerac was in New Orleans, which is a magical place, a magical backdrop, certainly, for any cocktail experience. So they're connected, I guess.
Yeah, and I think while a traditional old-fashioned is going to have some of that, I think, for a number of people as well, encountering that, that hint of absinthe or whatever, that sweetness and the kind of the anise right there is very it's this interesting contrast between the two as well.
And it's polarizing. I think it's more a bartender's drink than maybe the layman, right? Because a lot of people, if they're not used to it, they don't like that kind of licorice ingredient, and it can be a polarizing drink. But it's frustrating too, because I appreciate licorice. I love seeing that. I love seeing absinthe on any menu, and you just know when your friends or we're working on cocktails and you see a menu go up and you're like, man, that one is not going to get ordered enough because it's so good, but people will see the absinthe and get turned off, and that's a whole other category. Someone needs to lead the charge to start educating people and getting folks back into absinthe.
Yeah. And I think that is, when you're actually working more the front end of the bar or serving, for me, when I occasionally am up there, I think about, it's like, how do I, without pushing, try to get somebody excited about something that I feel like they could quickly overlook because they don't understand it, or, if they're, for a lot of the lay people, like, see absinthe, that's that thing that's going to make me hallucinate, or, it's like getting them excited about those things as opposed to, just allowing them to do their panic order.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think setting the stage, right? Like letting them feel relaxed is everything. If a guest feels rushed, or they feel like they don't have your attention or your time, they will default to order the fastest thing or the easiest thing so that they're not bothering you, right? Like, well, what if this bartender doesn't have time for me? It's a lot easier if they feel like they're being rushed to just go for the vodka sodas of the world. But step one is making sure that they know they have time with you and that they're comfortable, and then you can gain their trust, right? Like working through things that they like, get them, encouraged to maybe try something different, and then, if you can, if your program allows, to make it a free trial. Like, if you absolutely hate this drink after this discussion we've had and you don't love it, that's okay. We can always make a vodka soda. We can always make, the simplest, easiest thing. But yeah, I think when you have the education and a moment to really talk about ingredients or talk about how to get out of your comfort zone, the overall experience is better. And hopefully that means they come back weekly.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing, just like in terms of getting to know you, the person. So I saw somewhere listed, it seemed like one of your dreams would be a John Waters style boutique hotel with pool bar. I am quasi familiar with John Waters? Tell us about this weirdo and why and why you're drawn to this.
Well, John Waters is one of my favorite humans. I've seen him on tour many times. I don't know. I think the obsession started when I was a child because I saw Hairspray when I was a kid, and the original, not to be confused with the musical. And he's a wacky, really fun director who has like kind of this tongue-in-cheek I don't know if it's antagonism. I don't want to say that, but he's very in your face about like highbrow everything, right? He wants to like tear down these assumptions about like good breeding and this old school culture of good taste. And so he's the king of bad taste. I think they call him the Pope of Trash, as it's been known. But it's because he does a lot of comedy in his films where he is either, speaking in the person of someone who's like rich, hoity-toity, snotty, and then kind of tearing down those walls. And those end up being the villains. And the good people, the protagonist in his film is usually someone who is not liked in normal society, right? Like someone who we would typically dismiss or even fear. So it's nice to have that complete opposite. And I'm obsessed with him. But yeah, the hotel, patent pending. No one take my idea.
That's right.
I don't know. Honestly, I don't even know if people would come to this hotel, but it would still be fun. And pool bar is an essential, non-negotiable, must-have pool bar.
And at the very quickly, without all the, not very quickly, but like without every single last detail, what does a John Waters hotel feel like? What might I encounter there?
A lot of colorful rooms, right? A lot of kind of vintage style. Music is important. Music plays a huge part in all John Waters films, and also just in my own life personally. And I maybe not entirely because of John Waters, but since I was a kid, just always been into old school music, a lot of doo-wop, a lot of early jazz, and some like early Delta blues, stuff like that. I mean, it's hard not to like the blues when you're in Chicago anyway. And so I'm drawn to kind of those other like concepts of really fun music, classic style, and bright colors.
Well, some of that has the makings for, I think, a look of a tiki bar too, as well.
Yeah,
so
there's some crossover.
Yeah, well, and I think too, in terms of prior to your current gig, which we'll talk about, so you were at Lost Lake and Three Dots and a Dash too. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Yeah. So both by Paul McGee.
Yep. So, yeah. I worked for Paul. I got hired a few months before the opening for Three Dots and a Dash. And then when Paul left there to open Lost Lake, I was one of the few bartenders that went with. So I just kind of followed that train. I love Paul McGee. He's a friend of mine, and he's a really great mentor. He's the first person I've ever worked for that bothered to educate his staff. And we had a really great weekly education program, even after the open, even at one of the busiest bars in the country. We were still dedicated to doing weekly deep dives either on a specific country of rum producers or specific producers and their terroir, their production methods, their aging, just kind of everything, and taste everything. It's really important to be able to offer that to your bartenders so they know what is in every drink, not just like a drink robot told a recipe and go. So it was great to have that. But I got into tiki kind of before that. I was already into the style because I was in like a rockabilly band, and it was like they're connected somehow. I don't know why there's crossover, just old school. I guess people like wearing costumes. From like rockabilly music. I liked tiki bars, but there weren't really any that I would go to that had great drinks. So when Paul was opening a place, I knew Paul from The Whistler, and I was like, if anyone's going to make a great tiki drink, it's going to be Paul McGee. And I was right. And here we are all these years later.
Wow. Yeah. I feel like, on the podcast, I've talked about tiki before, but just for the sake of recircling back to it for a minute. So because part of the work you do, which I think is very important, I'm very impassioned about this idea of like reintroducing people to rum. But talk to us a little bit about tiki as a concept and what people can expect in a great tiki bar as opposed to the one that's just all juice and crappy rum or whatever. So.
Yeah, I think the inception of tiki wasn't even called tiki. It was just an escapist concept created by a guy in California. He was his name was Don the Beachcomber. He legally changed his name. And he wanted to create this space. He was a masterful bartender, just kind of out of nowhere. He didn't come from a background of bartending, but he was beach hopping, I guess, and collecting rum. And he had rubbed a lot of elbows doing set design in Hollywood with all of these like artifacts that he'd taken from island to island. And so while there was this kind of exotification of Polynesian culture, he kind of had the tools already to show off these places with artifacts that he had. And that gave him the idea to kind of put together this bar. So the bar was tiny, it was escapist, it didn't technically have any like tiki as we know them, like tiki actually are the gods. And it became known as tiki years and years later, but started with him, hit the table. And then Trader Vic, who was up in San Francisco Bay Area, in Oakland, he started his own bar. He had a different theme bar, but when he saw what Don the Beachcomber was doing, he wanted to do the same. And it was a hit. They commercialized it. It came at the right time, I think, when a lot of America in the 40s could not travel, could not afford to travel. There was a war. So escapism was really necessary for folks, just for their own sanity. And with the ebb and flow of time, we've seen it kind of come and go in popularity, partially because of just like access. I think when people can travel, they don't need the at-home like tiki bars as much, maybe. But the tiki itself has evolved even now, right? We have so many bars who are distancing themselves from the kind of very garish and this like stolen artifact style, and getting into something maybe just vaguely tropical or something that is creative, but maybe in their own cultural bandwidth, I guess. So we're seeing it change. I'm embracing that change. I think it's long overdue. When we were at Lost Lake, we made a strong effort to just never have like any iconography, any faces in mugs, everything. We leaned more towards plants and animals, fish-shaped mugs and birds and things like that, because it was not offensive. We don't want to be offensive. The idea that this movement was created out of escapism, but then leaned very heavily on like mysticism and exotification of real places, it's offensive. So we're seeing that change.
It's one thing that I'm hopeful for with like the big movement around agave right now too. And while they're not necessarily on a complete parallel course, as we see this rising quality of all these tequilas, all these mezcals, it's kind of the transition from this is a party spirit with salt and lime and crappy booze. It's more like hopefully that part also in tandem helps kind of dignify, like, let's not treat Mexican or Hispanic culture as a punchline, but as something to be celebrated and revered.
Yeah, gosh, I hope so. It's been interesting to watch agave rise in popularity in a real way. I think like my family, we're Mexican American, and seeing seeing the better the best versions of agave distillates coming to market in the U.S. The problem is who owns these products.
And that part's right. You're right. Yes.
So there is still this kind of the ownership of it all, and how much are people getting paid? I mean, we need to talk about labor. We need to ask those questions. It's very easy to taste something and know that it's very good. But I think we have to hold each other responsible as purveyors and supplier and, on all sides, right? I think bartenders are put to this task daily, but to hold suppliers responsible and to make sure that we know where things are coming from. And make sure that they're ethically sourced if they're sourced, if they are fully owned, who is in charge of that financial situation. Because agave takes forever to grow, right? It's not a grass. It's not like sugarcane is a completely different story because there are issues with rum and raising the bar of rum. But sugarcane grows very easily. We have issues with molasses sourcing for sure. But agave, you're waiting years. So I get nervous when I see all these people get on the bandwagon, and then what is tequila going to look like in 5 years? No one knows. And who's going to have the bags of money when the dust settles is, a little nerve-wracking.
And so I'm doing hosting some tastings in a couple of weeks, and I went out of my way to be like, okay, how do we have a conversation during these tastings about, these are owned in the country, and how do you talk about what percentage is going back to the growers? So absolutely, I think there is the double-edged sword of that visibility, and that pressure means like, oh, there's an opportunity to make money. Let's send in international, investors, and then it all becomes a yield game.
Right. The yield game is a losing game. And ultimately, it's easy, you do need investors. It's really hard to distribute out of Mexico. I know a lot of people in that field, and it's not an easy battle. So I understand the desire to partner up with investors, but when it comes to yield, you will lose. It is a finite amount. And so we have to be patient. We literally have to wait for plants to grow.
Yeah. So moving over to after many, many years of enjoying life behind the stick, you've now moved out to the other side. So tell us a little bit about, so I have a French last name, but that doesn't mean my French is any good. So Maison Ferrand, or Ferrand, however you say that, is a company that owns Plantation, who you primarily represent. Tell us a little bit about Maison, and then we can get into Plantation.
Yeah, Ferrand. So Ferrand is owned and operated, I guess. The CEO is Alexander Gabriel. He's also the master blender. So he started back in the 80s, got enthusiastic about cognac, he went into business with the Ferrand company, and then took over for the entire production. So by 1989, it was official, I believe, or 86. And then
I believe my notes say 89.
Yeah, so he started in 86, and then it became full ownership by 89. We launched a gin brand in 96, which we also produce. So it's not technically like an outside brand. Ferrand is the cognac, Citadel is the gin. And then we launched Plantation rum in 1999. So just 10 years later, he's in the rum game. But he started as a bottler, and we're now a producer as well. So we were fortunate enough to buy the West Indies Rum Distillery back in 2017. That was kind of a part of a package deal. So with that ownership, we also share 1/3 ownership with the National Rums of Jamaica, which gives us Long Pond and Clarendon. And those two distilleries, we were already sourcing a lot of rum from both West Indies Rum Distillery and the distilleries in Jamaica. So it's nice to kind of like finally have a real marriage with these teams and see where we can grow from there. Yeah.
So one of the things, I guess outside of things like, agricole, for example, that I like about Plantation is it feels like as I'm directing people to rum for the first time, it's like this is a brand that is it's pretty dependable and a great place to start. So I don't know how we begin to talk about your guys' suite of products. We don't have to cover all of them, but how do you kind of begin to walk people into what you guys are bringing to the market in this way?
I like to show off the diversity of rum. We are one of very few brands where you have rum from everywhere. So not just the rums we make in Barbados and Jamaica, but also Fiji, Peru, Panama. We have rum from so many places, and the conversation starts with the consumer, the guest, right? What do they like to drink? Where's their head at to start, right? Because you have to match those expectations. And then you can kind of expand from there. I have a lot of friends who get really into rum, especially bartenders, and we get so excited about super funky, heavy, high ester things. That's not where you want to start someone who maybe has never had rum before or doesn't drink spirits straight. You know, that there's like something off-putting about that, and that might turn them off of rum forever, which would be a travesty. So you got to pick and choose your battles when you're showing off rum to a new consumer. But I do think that our brand is very, it's affordable. It's kind of an easier intro for a lot of folks that maybe haven't given rum an opportunity. And we have something for everybody because we have the blends, we have the younger single origins, and then we have vintages that are much higher in price if you want something higher proof or, 10 to 15 years old. And then we have the extremes, which are extremely rare. So we do have kind of something for everybody, which makes it easy. We're kind of a catch-all that way. So it's not intimidating for folks if they want to just try one bottle of rum and it's under $30. You're in a safe space, as opposed to like, ooh, I don't know, can I afford this $100 bottle that someone told me I would like, but maybe you don't know. Like maybe it was the same person who's like, yeah, you should try this hot, overproof, funky rum, and you're like, I hate rum forever now.
Yeah. You said, for people at home listening, when we talk about high ester, talk about what esters are and perhaps why, that wouldn't be a high ester rum, wouldn't be the perfect place to start certain people on their beginning path right there.
Yeah, esters exist in all spirits in varying degrees, right? Like vodka would have maybe 20, 60, like very low ester count. And then you have Jamaican rums that could be, Jamaican is just a great place to start as an example, but they excel in making super high ester rums, and they can go upwards of 1,600, like 500, 400. So they're aromatic compounds that register as flavors on the palate. And in rum, they typically are like a range of fruity flavors. So you'll have rums that taste kind of like overripe banana or pineapple. That's a big trigger. Sometimes berry, like cherry or raspberry flavor coming through. And that's not flavored, right? That's just a fresh distillate. But those esters are dialed in. And there are ways to create esters in rum through production that they don't do in some other spirit categories, like vodka. Mm-hmm. Which would be interesting. I wonder if someone would do like a high dunder vodka.
I mean,
which is, well, it couldn't be like, you wouldn't be able to distill it that high proof. Anyway, I digress.
No, I think it's. I think trying to every once in a while challenge people's perception of what something should taste like is valuable. So whether or not there's a market, some distiller out there should mess around just for fun.
There's got to be flavorful vodka, and I just don't know about it. I am not a fan of neutral distillate, and I think if you made like an interesting wash for vodka, you would distill it away to nothing. So I don't know, those volatile compounds would just disappear. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, it's the general rub of like, I guess every once in a while you're using a spirit that is so flavorful that what you need is a little bit of heat, but maybe to pull that flavor down. But yeah, for the most part, when I see vodka, if vodka's leading, it's typically, I guess your espresso martinis, super hot right now again. But yeah, it's
they're back.
Yeah, they're back again. So now, obviously, we talked a minute ago when we were talking about tequila and mezcal. We were certainly talking about labor and fair cost and all of these things. So sugarcane obviously is a field that has its the murky and not so good parts of its own past. So how does a company like Plantation, who I love because it's a very affordable, delicious cocktail spirit. 3 stars is like I burn through that with stuff. But how do we think about labor amongst the relatively affordable price of something like 3 stars?
So the price of our rum will vary depending on accessibility or what's in the blend, right? The 3-star blend or our blends in general are made to fit that price point. So that's dependent on the distillates or the age of some of the rums in the blend, or certainly like a very young rum would be a lot more affordable to put in a blend than like a 10-year-old Jamaican. But for us, the importance of ethical molasses sourcing is paramount. As soon as we became producers, that was like issue number one. Item number one is make sure that when we are purchasing molasses, that they are from sources that are certified by multiple agencies as ethical in production and also sustainable environmentally. We're the first distillery in the Caribbean to be fully certified with Bon Sucro, which is a sugar-only certification. It's voluntary. There's no governmental agency saying you have to get certified, but we believe in doing the right thing. So being producers means that now all of our chain of custody is protected. And we encourage other partners to do so, when we're still sourcing from other places. It's tough to talk about certification and have these audits come through sugar mills and to sugarcane fields because a lot of smaller producers, they can't afford to be members. They can't afford to get the fancy audits. And I mean, they're not fancy audits, but having the audits it's an ongoing process. And so Bon Sucro is working with partners to make sure that everyone can get on board and make sure that they can help teach farmers and sugar mill operators at any stage, whether they're a huge operation or a smaller group, to streamline their production and make sure that not only are things efficient, but they're fair. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was rule number one. But that's kind of what we do out in West Indies Rum Distillery, and also NRJ is pushing for their own certification. It's important, and a lot of people don't ask. I think some of the price points that we see on the shelf is kind of a race to the bottom because there are producers
right.
That get they get breaks on taxes. They can like sell into the U.S. tax free, and they basically are operating in the green as soon as they turn the still on, and we don't have that in the West Indies. We have to kind of make sure that we're making something delicious because we can't afford to sell anything cheap. We would never hit that bottom price. Like 3-star is like affordable in the grand scheme of things, but there's definitely rum cheaper.
Oh yeah.
There's $11 bottles, and you look at that price point, and honestly, it's upsetting because I think it cheapens what rum is. The same way we've struggled, in agave spirits, is that rum should never be $11 a bottle. It especially if it had to get on a shipping container to get to wherever it is, right? I don't care what country it's from. It needs to have the respect of labor, and nothing $11 could really be paying for that labor.
Right. We won't name the very large producers that don't have to worry about the taxes, but they're out there. Look it up for yourself right there.
Yeah, it's funny because like we're not funny, but we're not a huge company. We have a great reputation, and we have a lot of close friends in the community. People who've been with us through bartending programs and stuff like that, but we're not huge. Like these, there's this misconception of conglomerate size, and we are so much smaller. We're less than 20 people for the whole U.S. And I think, it's just a testament of the quality of the products that we've been putting out all these years is that will speak first. It's not massive marketing dollar spends. We're using that money to support the sales, to support getting things at a reasonable price without, cutting out the bottom dollar.
What I will say, and you can check me on like the right comparison, but in terms of things that have a similar appearance, go out and buy a bottle of, or you probably have it somewhere deep in your liquor cabinet, break out your bottle of Bacardi Superior and taste that alongside of Plantation 3-Star, and you'll be like, oh, one of these is very rich in flavor, and this other one, well, it doesn't really taste like anything. So, whether I don't know if you would have a different one-to-one comparison, but I feel like that is part of the job. Is like saying, oh, you've had Bacardi before, and it's not memorable because, well, sorry, Superior doesn't taste like anything.
I think what some producers excel at is their aging. And I think Bacardi is one of those companies. They get a lot of recognition for their aged rums. And the bad rap that rum gets is from years of having very, very neutral style rum because it was competing with vodka. It was competing with a market in the 70s trying to stay relevant in kind of the growth of cocktail culture, or I guess the change in cocktail culture. And so meeting those needs and having this like very light, very neutral style rum made sense at the time. And we're coming out of that. I think we're definitely seeing that change. I see so many unaged rums coming to market that are really fun, really wild, really funky, some high proof, some not, but definitely way more flavorful than what was available when I started bartending in the 90s that did not exist.
Right. And you are right. That part of what we're looking at is a market need that is still being met, but in part reflecting what the state of the game was back then, for sure.
And I bet they would, change at some point. We might see companies like Bacardi and some others just start coming out with something funkier, or maybe start a new brand that will house that need, right? Because it's there, because bartenders want it. Bartenders want to play with something different. Those rums, funkier rums, have always existed technically. They just weren't for sale here,
Sure. Yes.
It's not that like funky Jamaican rum was invented yesterday. It's that we're finally getting people to drink it.
Yeah, there's demand to bring it out here and whatnot. Like we're seeing, for better and worse with agave as well. It's like many of these things have existed. It's more like, oh, there wasn't a market for it for a while.
Yeah, I want a mezcal but not smoky. Come on. Come on.
So in addition to obviously sourcing great product, blending great product, something that's interesting based on the company's arc is in part how you are aging many of the rums, because you started producing cognac, but now you kind of roll them from one set of barrels to another. Is that correct? And how are we going to, if they sat in the same barrel for a long period of time versus that rotation? Talk to us about how your flavors evolve because of that.
Yeah, the master blender's job is one of scent and taste, and it is not an easy job to get. A lot of these folks, specifically in cognac, they've been doing it for years and years, decades. And Alexander Gabriel's no different. We look at aging as a dynamic process, so not just notwithstanding the aging that we do on ships from Barbados to Jamaica, we literally we'll leave the rum in a barrel. We'll take the bourbon barrel, put it on a ship, take that, and it's, the motion of the ocean is affecting the aging, right? So we're still running tests on that to see how it changes and how dramatically the flavor is different. But then aging in a separate climate, slowing down the aging, and everything is a process. So we launched with this double aging technique, which we did not invent, of course. The idea of aging in one barrel and then using a different barrel happens out of necessity, because historically, before the history of bottling, you just had barrels and you used whatever you had laying around. So now, all these years later, we're like, what does that taste like? We have all these cognac barrels. Alexandre was getting really into rum. After some relationships in the Caribbean, he had a rum that was aged in ex-bourbon barrel and then decided to try and age it in cognac barrel, and it was delicious. So we accidentally became a brand kind of overnight because a retailer asked what the product was so they could sell it, and we're like, it's not a product. It's a thing we're working on. So, that's the long and short of it. But now we do all kinds of different barrels, and not just limited to rum. I mean, we've done cognac aged in rum barrels, which I think are delicious. That one came out last year, the Renegade. that's aged in a Jamaican Long Pond barrel. It's delicious. We can't call it cognac, of course, because it breaks the very strict rules of cognac, but it's real good. We've aged gin in, mulberry and wild cherry oak. And part of this is not just because we're curious and we want to experiment, although that's certainly part of it. It's also that in respect to the world we're living in, climate is an issue, and the rules will eventually have to change about, even in bourbon, right? First use American oak. How many trees do we have left? How often, how sustainable is this practice? And it made sense at the time because whatever the rumor about the lobbyist making sure to put that in the laws so that they could protect, Arkansas forest. There was like a lumber connection. So, even in France, you can't cut down a tree in France to make a barrel unless it's very old. I mean, almost 100 years old. You can't, it's just not accessible. So if we're going to be so confined to our barrel types, we're going to run out of barrels. And then the rules will have to change at some point. So we play around with barrels because that's just what we've always done. We'll see how it goes. I think the climate also is important to note because slowing down that process. I've had a lot of rum bottled in Europe that was aged in Europe exclusively. And, it's funny because you'll look at the bottle and you're like, it's 13 years old, but it's very light in color. So it's not aged in the Caribbean where it would get aggressively aged in that tropical climate. But in France, we have two different, not only is the climate not tropical, we have a lot lower angel share, but we have two different cellar styles. We have a humid cellar that's kind of dark and with an unfinished floor. And then we have a dry cellar that's, bright, kind of like the ones you see in bourbon country, stacked really tall and cement floor and kept technically as dry as possible. So we play around with temperature, and all of that is just a check on the barrel. If a barrel is getting too oaky or too spicy because it's in a dry cellar, we might move it to a humid cellar. We might, if it's not getting enough wood, or maybe we need to re-toast the lid, or we'll re-stave a barrel, or just put a couple of like fresh staves in between the old ones. The French, they're not throwing anything out. They're going to keep those barrels for as long as they can. So we have a lot of like zebra casks. They're just like pretty fun to look at, but that's not a thing you find in a lot of, not a thing you find in bourbon country for sure. Single-use American oak, it's one and done.
I appreciate so many other producers rising to use ex-bourbon barrels because, it does incense me. Like, I'm sure there's merit in terms of flavor at times or whatever, but it's just like, how many trees do we need to chop down? Like, just because we wrote the law this way.
Yeah,
so,
it seems like an arbitrary law that
it's very arbitrary, and I'm sure
that has not changed. We're not even going to we're not going to reopen that case. Okay.
Yeah.
Seems weird.
The lumber industry certainly loves it. And hey, here we are in the state of Missouri, which produces a huge percentage of it. So certainly, like the economic benefit of that, but that's a heavy toll on nature for sure in that regard.
Yeah, I don't think we should be cutting down all the trees, but
I think we should cut them all down. No,
cut them all down, burn it.
Here we go. Yeah.
Raise it.
So here, as people listen, kind of without being able to, liquid to lips everything, like here, if someone's sitting around, hey, they're sitting around, they're like, I want to open myself up to a flight of things to kind of experience the spectrum. Are there 3 or 4 things in your portfolio that you would kind of begin to recommend in terms of someone experiencing different flavors? Or how would you kind of guide people in a way of like, hey, if you're looking for the intro to rum through Plantation, here's a couple of things I would recommend you take a look at.
Yeah, I think any rum journey should start with Barbados because they are great at balance. They've been using column and pot still blend for a long time, since the late 1800s. Actually, our distillery, West Indies Rum Distillery, our founder, George Sade, he was the first to introduce column still to the island. And since then, Other distiller, I mean, he didn't invent the column still by any means, but this was in 1893. And since then, all of the production has been a blend of column and pot still, which I just think helps create a very balanced, kind of easy and elegant sip. So that's always a good place to start. And then from there, you can see where folks are headed. Like if flying blind, I could just recommend a few, but normally I like to have the conversation. Barbados is easy. Anyone can drink that. And then we can discuss next steps. Because if they want something a little bit aggressive, right? Like if someone normally drinks like high proof rye, maybe that's, maybe they need something heavier. Maybe I wouldn't send them to Panama, but maybe Jamaica, right? Like let's start with a Jamaican rum or maybe a Guyanese rum. If you're already into very bold flavors, that would be maybe a better jumping off point. So it varies, but you have to have Barbados in the lineup at some point.
And I could be attempting right here, just for people who like, okay, distillation, they've heard of it, but column versus pot. In general, column is more efficient, going to often produce slightly cleaner, lighter flavors. In pot stills, we tend to have some of these deeper, funkier flavors. Is that a half-decent synopsis just for people who are less familiar with distillation?
That's fair. I think what goes ignored in the column versus pot war is fermentation, which is so important.
Sure.
In all, just in general, in all distillation, also in wine and beer, right? Fermentation is so important. And we don't usually talk about it because it is very highly technical. So it can be kind of tricky to really dial that in and help folks understand. But you can make perfectly interesting and flavorful rums in a column still. But yes, the column still at its inception and its main access that the pot still doesn't have is that it can make large quantities of rum with less human interaction, I guess. But it's different, right? There's just different tools. I think what we talk about in the team is that, Alexandre, he's we like to think about everything as music. And it's funny because a lot of us are musicians on the team, but Alexandre knows the alembic pot still. That's cognac, right? That's all cognac producers knew. And then coming to the Caribbean, it's like you are a virtuoso and you can play all of these different instruments. A column isn't better than a pot. They're just different. They offer different opportunities. So what I'm hoping to show off later today are some distillates from West Indies distillery that are from different stills. So we can see why a pot still from the Gregg farm will taste different than a column still, which will taste also very different than like the new hot pot. They're two pot stills, but they taste completely different. Everything affects the flavor. So it's not just fermentation. It's like a package, like a fine-tuned instrument.
Sorry, guys. There's a tasting later today, and we love you, but you're not invited.
No one's invited. It's a secret.
It's definitely a secret. So one other thing, and then let me know if there's anything else you want to talk about. But so and it probably won't be the first time it's been covered, but talk to us a little bit about fermentation. So it's obviously we are taking a mash of things that have sugars. We're adding yeast in, and we are beginning to create alcohol. But talk to us a little bit about why this part is so important, because we notice at the end of distillation there's the booze, but in a way with fermentation we're creating the soup that is ultimately going to allow us to yield this spirit. So talk to us a little bit about fermentation.
Yeah, fermentation, all you need to make the wash technically is your sugar source, either sugarcane juice distillate, sugarcane juice, or sometimes they'll call it honey or syrup, because it doesn't actually come out of bees, and molasses, right? And then water and a yeast source. The yeast can be commercial, like a commercial yeast, brewer's yeast. There's plenty of options for that. And you'll get a much more like consistent product if you're using commercial yeast, because it's just it has one goal to just make sugar as fast as possible, just eat everything up and then become alcoholic as fast as possible. Your wash can bubble at about, I mean, if you're using commercial yeast, you can get it to like 7% ABV, and then you can distill that. We like to make wash that gets to about 4%. You end up suffering some of the yield of your distillate, but you end up with a higher flavor content. Molasses type is also very important in your fermentation. So in that wash, if you're using grade A, it doesn't have the same like kind of grimy mineral qualities that blackstrap has. And we like the yeast to struggle a little bit. You want them to kind of like fight. So we use blackstrap in our molasses, well, as our molasses blackstrap, which is C technically. But that's a style preference, right?
Will you tell the people what blackstrap molasses is?
Blackstrap is the third, it's like the final product of making sugar. So when you're making sugar, the first thing you do, you crush the sugar cane, you get the juice, you can cook the juice and evaporate the water content of the juice, and then you'll have the syrup. So you can make from the juice or you can make from syrup. Then you can put it in the centrifuge. Centrifuge after the first run will be grade A, which means that it will have the highest sugar content still in the molasses. Centrifuge a second time, that's grade B, and the third time is C. So it's the final, it's the end of the line. So you end up with the lowest sugar content in the molasses, but a much, much higher amount of like mineral quality. And those other ingredients, those non-sugar ingredients in your molasses are kind of what help like struggle with the yeast and help create different flavors. If you want a very light style of rum, just use grade A molasses. It'll be delicious, maybe kind of light. But again, that's all to say, I mean, maybe you did grade A molasses, but then you used some other like fermentation techniques or did like a 1 week long fermentation, that's going to affect the flavor too. So there's no set rules. There's no way to say that, grade A is always going to be light or, grade C is always going to be really funky. Like anything goes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a level of alchemy in terms of here, what are we starting with? What are we marrying it with for what length, et cetera?
It's really scientific. Yeah. I think, I see the production of rum kind of bandied about as some sort of accident or, we just happened upon rotting molasses and that's how rum was invented. Like, that doesn't give the labor any credit because we know that that's not the case. I mean, that would be silly to believe. But it is highly technical, and if you want any sort of consistency in your product, you have to keep track. You have to be very scientific in your approach. So it's great to be around our production team, especially the fermentation team. Dario and Terry at West Indies Rum Distillery, they are just wizards. They're super technical. It's really fun to watch them work and to talk to them about production because it's a completely different approach than a sales pitch you see at a tasting event or something.
Great. Terrific. Is there anything else we haven't covered that you want to talk about today at all? Anything that hasn't top of mind for you?
No, I don't know. I think ultimately I just want more people to be drinking rum. And if you're already drinking rum, drink good rum. Just try everything. I don't like people to box themselves in and feel like they can only have one style or, you get married to a specific product or something. There's new fun things coming to the U.S. all the time. So we're really fortunate, depending on where you live, of course, but we're very fortunate to have access to some of these beautiful products. And if you are even luckier, come to the Caribbean and visit, come see all the distilleries. I think it's a totally different experience to meet the team face to face and really experience the rum in its true natural setting because it lends that culture and that heritage in a context that doesn't exist or is a little bit harder to pinpoint when you're having it remotely. And then once you have that connection, never ends. I think rum is not like some other spirit categories in the way that it is transportive. If you taste rum from, a country like Barbados or Martinique or Jamaica, and you're lucky enough to have it on those islands, you can't separate that experience. Anytime I have Jamaican rum, I will think of Jamaica. There's no separating that experience, and I think that's beautiful. I don't see that in any other spirit category.
The diversity is wild, and I'll say that. I imagine you bump into this too, and there's something to be said for a well-aged spirit out there, but there is also, I think, for some people, it's like older equals better, and it's really just older equals older. It's great.
Right.
But the younger the stuff is, the more you're going to be able to taste the rum itself as opposed to the barrel. And barrels are great, but give yourself permission to drink unaged or younger aged spirits if older age stuff is your thing.
That's a huge point. The assumption that age is value is that age equates with value is really only existent in spirits. No one ever says that about me getting older out here. Like, no one's like, hey, Adrienne, coming into your 40s. Like, that's not the case in any other facet. But for some reason, we look at spirits and we think that older is always better. I'm the opposite. I think younger is always better. I like maybe a little bit of age here and there, but I want to taste what it is raw. I want to see what the production is working with at, the first go. And then maybe a lightly aged. Obviously that's just my preference, but I would encourage the same. Yeah, people should try other things and not equate age with automatic value because it's not a fact. I would say the opposite, that age can hide things that are lacking in value.
Yeah, and to kind of, for people out there who this is, you do you, but I think, hey, if you're in a circle of people that love aged spirits, while the first time you walk in with that unaged spirit to the party, they might go, what's this all about? You get to then tell them the story about, hey, if you really want to taste the corn from that whiskey, the rye,
Mm-hmm.
the less time something is aged, the more you'll be able to taste those raw ingredients. And especially, as Adrienne's talked about, when we're using the higher quality molasses, corn, agave, etc., we want to taste that terroir, that original ingredient. And so give yourself the luxury of being able to taste those raw ingredients better as opposed to more and more barrel over time.
Agreed. Yeah, let them know.
Yeah, that's right. Spread the word.
Spread the word.
So in terms of people keeping up with Plantation and you, so we'll link to it in the show notes, but what should people follow? What should they be typing into their browsers and socials and all that stuff?
Yeah, we have a website. We have an Instagram. We also have, the West Indies Rum Distillery has their own Instagram as well. And I think they're all the same, like at West Indies Rum Distillery, at plantation.rum. Those are easy ways to just find out more about production or about the brands. For me specifically, I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and all I do is travel around and talk about rum. So you can catch me outside, but that means fighting. I don't want to fight. But I do have rum always, and I will travel. So if there's a rum event or someone just has random rum questions, I'm always on.
There's she gonna be. So Adrienne, thanks so much for taking time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Great.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are two great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter. Or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.